With Ghost of Yotei just around the corner, I thought this would be an ideal time to look back at Ghost of Tsushima. In this video, we'll be going through the original experience, the Iki Island DLC, and the multiplayer Legends mode to answer the question, was Ghost of Tsushima actually good? Now, as some of you may know, I like to jump into games pretty much as blindly as I can. I didn't even know who made this game, and I have to say, it was actually really nice seeing these guys here. If you're of a certain age, you'll most likely recognize Sucker Punch Productions as the studio behind the most mistreated PlayStation intellectual properties like Sly and Infamous.
Look how they massacred my boy.
Or, well, I say some, but if you look at Sony, the better question is what exclusive IP has not been mistreated. I can only think of God of War at this point. At any rate, do beware, this video will contain massive spoilers for what is, quite frankly, a really good experience. So, without any further ado, grab yourself some sake and let's get right into it. Ghost of Tushima takes place in 1274, during the Mongol invasion of Japan. Now, to be clear, Tsushima is a real place, and the Mongol invasion did happen, but the game itself is far more of a work of fiction rather than an accurate retelling of these events. In fact, you'll encounter no real historical figures, Lord Shimura is fictional, and even the Sakai clan didn't exist until the 14th century. The studio itself confirms they did this specifically to avoid being insensitive, which is one heck of a way to squat and take a big fat dump on Ubisoft. At any rate, there are also a lot of other inconsistencies, like the weapons used by samurai at the time, the idea of the Bushido Code, which, while does contribute beautifully to the narrative, did not exist in that form back then, and is to some extent romanticized by movies and such media. Regardless, some concessions must be made if you want to make a satisfying gaming experience, and I feel this gave them enough liberty to do so, while also helping them create this cinematic samurai motif, which is what they were aiming for to begin with. I mean, the game even has a special mode dedicated to Akira Kurosawa, a prolific Japanese filmmaker whose work played a large role in shaping samurai media. It shouldn't be much of a surprise to know that Ghost of Tushima was influenced heavily by his contributions to the genre. All in all, I don't think this is something to be upset by. So, the game begins and we're put on the beach as the Mongols arrive in Tsushima, and this introductory sequence actually already captured my attention because of its writing. I am a bit of a sucker when it comes to good writing, because, let's be honest, games nowadays suffer from writing that is, to put it bluntly, pretty shit. So when Khotun Khan hits the scene, I was quite intrigued. He clearly doesn't care about honor or samurai customs since he just sets his opponent on fire, rather than duel him. But as he does so, he doesn't laugh or make a grand show out of it. He's stern, asking them whether they surrender. And even later, he shows some respect to Lord Shimura. Having learned their language to properly communicate, he attempts to convince him to surrender Tsushima to the Mongols so that the suffering of his people stops. He tries this consistently throughout the story. This was very interesting to me. Rather than going for the low-hanging fruit of a villain who revels in bloodshed and cruelty and war, the writers created a villain who's a lot more nuanced. Khotun is a very good and sneaky strategist. He's capable of cruelty, but he does so purely to end his conquest and move on, rather than reveling in it. Really good character work, and really early on too. Let's now switch focus to Jin Sakai, the main character. And, you know, characterization is done really well when your first instinct is to talk about the villain rather than the main character. Jin Sakai is a samurai under the command of his uncle. He is very much the stereotypical idea of a samurai, very much about honor, about dueling his opponents fairly. As a standalone character, he is not necessarily remarkable, but it's about how the narrative plays with his beliefs that makes his development intensely interesting. The game follows Jin in his efforts to defeat the Mongol invasion while traveling the open-world island of Tsushima. And I do have to mention really quick here, the game is gorgeous. There have been many games that look great, but that beauty of the world I would only get to appreciate when I would be really high up in a vantage point. Ghost of Tsushima, however, very much blew my expectations away. The environment is breathtaking constantly. There hasn't been a moment I traveled where my attention wouldn't immediately go and constantly stay on the environment, because it's intensely intrusive, in a good way. It assaults the senses via clashes of color or strong monochromatic environments. It captures your eyes as the trees rustle in the wind and the petals and leaves alike flutter beside you. The environment is vibrant and feels alive in its flow. There is a lot of effort to be appreciated here that goes far beyond just making the world look nice. Even when we get to the war-torn areas, there is still a feeling to be cultivated here, because you know how beautiful these places can be. It's sort of like a reminder of what's at stake here, which is particularly effective when you go high up to a vantage point and see the stunning views of Tsushima, but also fires in the distance. There is something to lose here, and the environment conveys that motif like no other game I've experienced. From a technical perspective, I would be remiss not to say that I was impressed by how well optimized the game is, because it runs really well, but also looks really good. But what blew me away is the loading time, in the sense that there is pretty much none. Now, this is to be taken with a small grain of salt, because I did play this game on a PS5, and it's likely that the game was very well optimized for it. But how can I not be impressed when I choose to fast travel, and not even a second later everything is loaded and I can go on my way? Even failure doesn't feel as punishing, because 1 second later and I'm back at it again. Even me saying this is impressive is a severe understatement. This is a game changer. I've never experienced something like this. Oh, and since we're discussing impressive technology, I am absolutely going to give the game massive praise for NPCs basically keeping up with you. Doesn't matter whether you're on foot or on horseback or sneaking, I've never had an NPC falling behind. And I have to do this because in current year 2025, this is not standard. What the fuck? Okay, so I've veered off quite a bit talking about the environment and the performance, so let's go back a bit. By the end of the intro sequence, it's clear that Jin is one of the last warriors left on Tsushima. This is instrumental to Jin's character work, because we are shown that from a very young age he's been conditioned to believe in this samurai code of honor. But his beliefs are superimposed against circumstances where it would be very easy for him to die in vain, where his approach actively puts others in danger. If he were to die, Tsushima would be doomed and the Mongols would freely advance into the mainland. This is very well highlighted when he attempts to free Shimura at the start, nearly getting himself killed, and later on when he has to rescue prisoners, but getting detected will prompt the Mongols to execute them. This sets up a very compelling conflict within Jin. This ideal of honor is all he knows, it's what he's been grown up to respect to the highest degree, and he got to live up to that point in a sort of social circle where that's all that matters. That's all gone now. The samurai of Tsushima are no more, everyone he knew is either captured or dead or far away. He is confronted with the realities of war. War isn't honorable, war isn't fair, war is cruel, innocent people die. This is what's at the center of Jin's compelling duality, and it's also why I found myself very permissive of the game's interpretation of the Bushido code. As I said before, this code of honor is definitely not accurate, but this exaggeration of it and its effects on Jin as a character helps set this duality really well. We get to see how Jin interprets honor and how its importance is absolute, only to be confronted later with the idea that this may not be the right approach for himself and the people of Tsushima. The game forms a very simple but effective question. What's the value of one man's honor to the lives of many? And just like that, the game is able to organically justify this slow shift in Jin's character towards the idea of a ghost, a merciless and terrifying protector of Tsushima that is otherwise not honorable at all, sort of the hero we need, not the one we deserve. But at the same time, at the back of our minds, there is this tingling sensation of, hey, maybe these things are also to some extent wrong. It feels wrong to just leave these concepts of honor so thoroughly behind, as if Jin erases a part of himself. A part that does matter to some people around him, like Lord Shimura, who's more of a father figure to him. It's genuinely heartbreaking to see him so disappointed after all of his efforts to teach Jin about honor. This is what makes this switch feel so sentimentally crushing. It's part of this grand sacrifice Jin has to make to save his home. The writing is also nuanced enough not to have the answer be as simple as, well, just embrace becoming a ghost and everything is well and good. There was one moment in the Mongol assault on Yarikawa that stuck with me. It's this great sequence where Jin gives into his rage, completely terrifying the Mongols, and it feels so fucking great to finally make these fuckers recede in terror. After seeing repeatedly what these invaders have done to the people of Tsushima, making them cower in fear feels so gratifying. This bit marks a notable turn in the tide of war by also making a notable turn within Jin. You unlock more and more things in Jin's kit that leave enemies terrified, your ghost stance butchers any unit in one hit, and their allies watch and cover in fear. It's great. But slowly, as this power gets into your head, you start to realize you are becoming a monster. This is not to say that it inherently affects how the Mongols behave. They'd most likely still resort to cruelty and underhanded tactics, but it does bring up an inner conflict within Jin that does eventually spill over. As a consequence to Jin's emboldened use of poison, the Mongols also learn to use it themselves. They test it on innocent prisoners, and their archers will use it against you. Not to mention that Khotan even intends to use it in his conquest of the mainland. The stakes grow higher, and this is due to Jin's growth as a ghost. That's what further elevates the writing. The answer isn't as black and white as just become the ghost. There are always consequences to what Jin does and what he becomes. The duality between samurai and ghost is maintained throughout, whereas the question was what's one man's honor to the lives of many, it evolves into witnessing the consequences of going too far in becoming a symbol of fear to the Mongols. After all, you know what they say about a cornered dog. In my opinion, this is fantastic writing, and I do have to give the game massive props for being able to let these themes also seep into your very own approach of the gameplay. You see, the game gives you quite a bit of leeway as to how you approach certain situations. Even in hostage situations, you're given the freedom to approach the enemies head-on. Honorably, you might say, and then have to stop enemies from executing prisoners while doing so. In fact, there are only a handful of occasions where you're forced into stealth, but when I was given the opportunity to be stealthy, I found myself opting not to do so. This is in part due to the game's combat system being incredibly fun, gratifying, and frankly, insanely elegant, but it's mostly because of the narrative's influence compelling me to behave this way. It feels wrong to use these underhanded tactics because of how we get to know Jin. In fact, the game goes as far as giving you flashbacks whenever you start doing these things frequently, and it's such a great way of highlighting this inner struggle. Then, later on, when he is confronted with the disastrous consequences of his uncle's honorable tactics, or rather, lack thereof, we get to see this shift in Jin as he becomes more and more willing to leave honor aside for the sake of avoiding unnecessary casualties. And it's all done in a way that makes sense and is compelling. Jin and us ourselves are confronted with the reality that his approach is quite poor in a war. I mean, hell, Shimura is willing to sacrifice a lot of people for his own commitment to honor, people they need in this conflict.
Some of you may die, but it's a sacrifice I am willing to make.
And so we have another shift that affects gameplay, as these dishonorable methods become more understandable, and I found myself employing them with much greater freedom than before. This is exactly why I respect the writing in this game. It's been very rare for me to experience a game where there is such a seamless connection between writing and gameplay behavior, and Ghost of Tsushima really nails this, while also elevating Jin's character through this very complex inner conflict. So I've talked quite a bit about the gameplay, but haven't really discussed it on its own individual merits, which I'll do now. The combat is fantastic, a beautiful combination between challenge, flow, and style. At its basis, I absolutely love how you have to actively look at enemies to figure out whether they're attacking, because the game doesn't have a conventional visual or audio tell for when they do so. And I also like the realism behind the range units having to announce their attacks so that their allies duck. It's an audio tell, sure, but it's not particularly the conventional sort of tell you'd expect. All of these factors create a basis that is very satisfying to play with, because it feels gratifying to read enemy attacks, especially in high-stress situations, and especially because it's really easy to die, at least at the start. Now, the game does have gamified tells for attacks that are not blockable, but in a way you do have to be able to differentiate between them, so I'm okay with it. The animations and how they contribute to the flow of combat are also fantastic, but early on I stated that its combat is incredibly elegant, and that's what elevated the system for me. Let me ask you a simple question. What comes to mind when you think samurai experience? You think of this beauty in combat that elevates it from simple violence, that final blow when you take a moment, the wind rustles about, and your enemy shortly collapses. There's something deeply cinematic about it, isn't it? Many action games don't really capitalize on this concept of a final blow. In fact, it's pretty usual to just kill an enemy and keep attacking, because really, it's about mashing buttons. And come to think of it, it does take away from how stylish combat can be, and how it can engage you that way. Ghost of Tsushima, in trying to deliver that high-fidelity samurai experience really nails the idea of a final blow, and its synergy with the flow of combat really shines. Now, this might be considered somewhat pedantic, since it is to some extent a detail, but it's a great segue into just how many more additive stylistic touches the combat has. For example, the simple act of sheathing your katana is instantly more involved when you can opt to do it yourself in that stylized samurai flair. And the thing that gets me, like, genuinely, who gives a shit about sheathing your weapon? Like, nobody cares about that. And yet, by a simple flick of the touchpad, the game made me care enough to do it just after about every combat encounter. This goes to show how they understood that any small detail can convey such an engaging piece of characterization. As a side note, I also like the attention to detail here, because Jin never slams his katana back into the scabbard. This misconception comes from a lot of samurai media, but it's actually something you should never do because it can damage your katana. So yeah, it's just a really cool attention to detail. Then we have the standoff system, which I did enjoy as a component. I loved how opponents will try to bait you into attacking prematurely, the slow-mo, the audio, the blood splattering, it's great. It's really cinematic and stylish, but I do have a few grievances about it that we have to discuss. From a technical perspective, initiating a standoff can be a bit finicky. I felt like the areas where you can start a standoff are very specific. I had moments where I had to awkwardly turn around and find again the spot where the prompt appears. Then, after initiating it, the game goes through the motions of setting up the standoff rather unconvincingly. It's very clear that it just teleports the enemies around, which is a shame. I would have loved the effect of seeing them gather, walking from their camps to build tension, before cutting it down brutally as they rush towards Jin. It also doesn't help that the game sometimes puts us in places that are really odd. Like, rather than taking advantage of this amazing scenery, it puts you against the backdrop of some fucking wall. Or even worse, has elements in the environment severely obstructing your view. And that is on top of the fact that the camera tends to rotate quite a lot when you do chain kills. I really love standoffs, I use them in pretty much every opportunity they'd show up, but I do wish they would have fleshed them out a bit more, and hope they'll do them better if they return in the sequel. As they stand, standoffs are a very cool component that unjustly suffer from small short-sighted issues, which is a pity because of how well they could blend gameplay with cinematography. Apart from that, we, of course, also have stealth, but to be completely honest, I don't want to spend too much time talking about it because it's pretty much just the standard gameplay you can expect. Basically, a lot of times you'll ask yourself, how the fuck are they not seeing me?
Must have been the wind.
What I will say I appreciate about it is that the locations are always built with stealth in mind as a possible option, and that's even when the narrative nudges you towards not using it, like at the start. I think this environmental consistency is to be appreciated. That being said, I do think that this combined duality of honor and stealth, from a gameplay perspective, is not done particularly well. So, earlier I stated that the game gives you a bit of leeway as to whether you'd like to approach situations head-on or through stealth. This is actually part of my opinion that the game bends itself needlessly quite a bit to make way for player choices that otherwise don't really fit this experience. It's something noticeable early on when the game gives you choices as to how you respond in dialogue, and I don't exactly understand why. Nothing really changes as a consequence of your choice outside of one or two lines of dialogue. It's this strange divide where the game gives you some control over Jin's character in dialogue, but otherwise in the larger narrative, his character is already decided. The writers have a definite perspective on what happens and what Jin does and what he thinks. This is very much exacerbated by the game's freedom as to how you approach certain hostage situations. I mean, sure, I appreciate being able to face threats non-stealthily because of how delicious it's been to experience the game's combat system, but a hostage situation is a hostage situation. So the game does this silly thing where a certain enemy will decide to execute a prisoner and it will show you visually who it is and who they're going for, as if you can read their mind, going against this principle of keeping enemy behavior communicated only through their animations. Furthermore, when they get to the prisoner, they don't just immediately execute them, they dally around for a few seconds because the game forces them to give you a second chance to stop them. It's really gamified in a way that doesn't really make any realistic sense. These are the sections where I genuinely wish that the game would restrain you to a particular playstyle. If the game, narratively, is meant to portray Jin as someone moving away from honor to become the feared Ghost of Tsushima, having such liberty to choose your approach really takes away from that premise. Because what happens if the player forces the playstyle that isn't compatible with your narrative? That's what happened in my case. I really avoided touching stealth as much as I could. It had this strange effect of making me think I had some agency over Jin's story, when in reality there is no such agency to be had. At worst, it made the narrative experience rather confusing. When I was getting those flashback sequences after killing enemies dishonorably, I thought it was my fault this is happening, but it was actually just the game trying to emphasize Jin's changing behavior. I was not able to enjoy a potentially great narrative device because I thought I was doing something wrong. Giving so much freedom, in my opinion, was not a good decision. It took a lot away from Jin's journey from samurai to ghost. The ending is also very much affected by this. And look, I really want to try and emphasize here that I don't want to take away from how deeply emotional the last sequence is. It's beautiful as a way to wrap up the story, with fantastic cinematography. But why give me the choice to spare or kill Shimura? I'm sure you and I can rationalize making either decision, but if you aim to present a theme where dishonor begets misery, or the spiritual and emotional sacrifice one must make to win a war, you really shouldn't do this. In many ways, I feel that this choice was added mainly for the Western audiences, because we always want a happy ending. But logically, culturally, does this make any sense? Am I supposed to think that the shogunate would just let go of the fact that Shimura failed to execute Jin? Most likely not. He could be stripped of power, his clan might be disbanded, or at worst he might even be forced into harakiri. I mean, even Shimura himself is broken. Would he really move on? Would he be able to have a family while being weighted down by his failures and Jin? Would Jin himself disrespect his uncle's last wish? I just don't see it. And it is a bit weird that the game finally gives you genuine agency over a choice that will have no palpable consequences whatsoever, since this is the end of the story. Fortunately, this is as negative as I'm going to get about Ghost of Tsushima, and while I might have sounded quite negative about these choices, I do want to clarify that in the grand scope of the game, they don't really play that large of a role. In fact, let's cleanse our palate by discussing something that quite positively surprised me. When I think of an open world, I commonly think of a large landmass with nothing particularly special to do, just you following in the direction of a dot on your screen and also loads of collectibles. Thanks, Ubisoft. Now, Ghost of Tsushima doesn't really go as far as reinventing the wheel. It does feature a lot of what you'd expect from an open world: collectibles, special locations, enemy strongholds, etc. But it does things differently enough to make the experience feel somewhat fresh. One of the coolest of such things is how the game shows you where you have to go. Rather than have a bog standard indicator, the wind tells you where to go. I honestly kinda wish that the wind in the Netherlands would have such a purpose. I mean, it's always windy, and rather strongly so. At least it could fulfill that purpose, rather than just be cold, like a prick. It's actively cool how the game uses its environment to tell you where to go, and you can always call for a stronger wind, which doesn't just tell you more clearly where to go, but also invokes that iconic artistic motif of petals and leaves rustling in the wind. It's really beautiful, really smart, and a brilliant way of using creativity to redefine a fairly simple gaming concept while also paying homage to the cultural source material. When it comes to collectibles, I love how the environment comes alive again with little animals showing you where to go, like following foxes to find shrines and also petting the foxes. Oh my god, huge plus. Golden birds showing you places with activities, and fireflies near collectibles. Now, these collectibles aren't anything special. They combine the excitement of looking for something that may or may not be there with the thrill of wanting to look up for a guide. There is an outfit that lets you find them via the wind, but it does eventually descend into a hot or cold situation. It makes the controller vibrate if you're close to a collectible, but sooner or later you will confuse them with a vibration that comes from walking or other bits of movement. Seriously, the controller vibrates at pretty much everything in this game. Not particularly great, but some of the other collectibles that come in the form of activities I quite liked. For example, you have hot springs, and what I feel elevates them as an activity is that this is not just something that increases your health, but also gives Jin an opportunity to shine as a character because he gets introspective about recent happenings. It's a cool way to interact with a more concealed part of Jin's personality, and also holy fuck, he has a bubble butt. I am jealous. Like, girl, this is some bullshit. And then you have activities heavily influenced by culture. For example, the bamboo cutting minigame is based on tameshigiri, the art of test cutting. You also have places where you can create a haiku while reflecting on different concepts, accompanied by meditative music and beautiful scenery. It's moments like these that show how Sucker Punch really wanted to do right by Japanese culture. I find it 100% believable that they consulted cultural experts in creating a lot of these interactions in order to fulfill their desire of approaching things in a way that is respectful while also elevating the experience. Just ignore the fact that tameshigiri and haikus were both popularized in the 17th century. Related to this, I was quite surprised to find out that Sucker Punch was accused of cultural appropriation over Ghost of Tsushima. I mean, seriously, are there any other games commonly held to this sort of standard? Was God of War ever accused of cultural appropriation? I don't think so. And quite frankly they should, because they do it absolutely wrong. Everyone knows you can't have a game set in ancient Greece and not have about 2 to 3 gay orgies. Apart from that, I will give them props for making the world feel somewhat reactive in respect to your exploration. There are many random NPCs you can talk to, and they will let you know of enemy-controlled areas or other curiosities. This is all fine and dandy, but what I like is that when you're out and about, what you'll very commonly encounter are groups of Mongols with prisoners, and you can free those prisoners to receive either a reward or some info about something you can explore. Is this pedantic? Sure, but it goes to show how empty many open worlds feel that this gets a praise out of me. Let's wrap up talking about the base game by discussing the characters and stories of the wider narrative. What I appreciate a lot about the story of Ghost of Tsushima is actually, to some extent, its straightforwardness. This is a story about war, being invaded by an overwhelming force, and how characters of different backgrounds come together to repel it. And the narrative never deviates from that premise. After experiencing so many AAA stories that like to pretend their writing is too smart for their own good, with weird plot twists that don't work or poorly written characters, I've come to really appreciate something simpler that is concise and makes sense, even when it comes to the many side quests of random NPCs, which I was apprehensive about at first, because games tend to veer very off course when it comes to telling side stories. Looking at you, Final Fantasy XVI. You and your quest about delivering food to people like the savior of the world is some fucking barista. While I will say that these side quests are nothing particularly special in a functional sense, I do, however, appreciate their thematic consistency. It's always about the tragedies that befall common folk in wars, the atrocities they endure, having their land stolen, families dying, being subjected to cruel treatment, or selling each other out to survive. Because in the end, they're not samurai, they can't defend themselves. And it's a great exercise in disempowerment too, because Jin will try to intervene, he will eliminate the threat, but usually the damage is already done. Rarely, if ever, do these stories have a happy ending, and you're confronted with the fact that you can't save everyone in this war, no matter how much you want to or try. It's bleak, but in a way that is realistic and purposeful. Then we have the tales of the game's side characters, like Masako, Ishikawa, and Norio. Christ, I feel like my pronunciation is so bad. What I like about these is that they offer the perfect balance between letting the side characters take the spotlight, with Jin also being a present actor that affects them rather than fading into the background. And that's on top of being rather compelling stories too. Masako's tale is a prime example of this. It's this dark story of revenge, as Masako is left as the last surviving member of her family, and we bear witness to the grief and rage that festers within her. It's incredibly depressing to have her share how she's had to bury every member of her family, how she finds her children hanged on the battlefield. It's understandable given this cruelty and misfortune that she'd be overtaken by revenge so intensely, and rather than have Jin there as set dressing, he actively becomes the voice of temperance. His presence is there as a question: does everyone who took part in this deserve to die? He even goes as far as to intervene when it comes to Masako wanting to slay a monk who has been helping survivors. Jin is there to directly challenge Masako's motivation for revenge, clashing with her on the idea that penance doesn't have to take priority over someone's capacity to do good. As a side note, I have to laugh at the idea that Ghost of Yotei represents the series' descent into wokeness, especially because Masako is shown to be at the very least bisexual due to her relationship with Mai. Oh, sorry babes, the game was a big bad woke all along. Oh. It's almost like these grifters don't play the games they talk about. Ishikawa's tale is another very compelling narrative. It explores the relationship between teacher and student, but it's a relationship of intensity. Ishikawa's role as a teacher makes him internalize Tomoe's success, and later the crushing weight of her failures. Ishikawa feels great pain and shame over Tomoe's choice to join the Mongols, enabling their cruelty and sharing the art of the bow. But here's where something interesting happens, because Jin gets to talk to Tomoe and her actions become understandable. Ishikawa is a cruel teacher, while Tomoe was previously a simple commoner trying to survive. This is already a huge divide in perspectives, but it's made worse by Ishikawa's unforgiving tutelage, how he dangles this life that Tomoe desires and taking it away so absolutely. It makes sense for her to join the Mongols because survival is what she's known her entire life. It makes sense for her to deflect and ask for help from Jin and Ishikawa, not just because the Mongols were turning on her, but also because somewhere down the line she understands that what she's done is wrong. It's this sort of narrative where you get to interact with the antagonist and you get moments where they are humanized beyond just being villainous props, where we realize that Ishikawa's failure weighs so hard on him that his perspective of Tomoe is severely warped, and vice versa. You can't really confirm whether either of them are inherently good or bad, and in the end, Jin is also there by Ishikawa's side to once again be the voice of temperance. As Tomoe flees, she promises to leave the way of the bow behind, and perhaps Ishikawa can also let go of his failures in time. I completely fell in love with the stories of Tsushima. I was deeply immersed because the writing is really good. This is what Rise of the Ronin wanted to be, a fantastically written piece that doesn't overstay its welcome by adding too many characters. This is what Assassin's Creed Shadows wanted to be, were it not made by Ubisoft. This contributes a lot to what I say is straightforward about the overall narrative of the game. The perspective of every character is clear and understandable. Yuna has been a thief all her life. It makes sense that she doesn't get all this honor talk about samurai, and pushes Jin to become the ghost, especially after Taka dies. On the opposing side, Shimura has always been about honor, hence why it's been so important for him to impart this wisdom on Jin, and make him steer away from becoming the ghost. Ishikawa and Masako still support Jin because they are duty-bound to do so, especially after helping them in their individual pursuits. Ishikawa even hints that while his methods are not honorable, he understands their necessity. Ryuza's betrayal makes sense because working with Jin has resulted in nothing for his starving Straw Hats, and the Mongols might be able to provide. This is great. Different influences with different perspectives, all playing a believable role in the overarching narrative. I think the writing is incredibly smart to focus on two main things alone: the Mongol invasion and the cruelty of war it implies, and Jin's duality between samurai and ghost. These themes work well together, and the writers had a very clear idea about how these characters would all fit in both. In the end, it's been a joy to experience this narrative, and the gameplay as well. I'd go as far as to say that it's one of the few games in recent memory that I would say I've conclusively enjoyed, certainly by virtue of how much of a high-fidelity experience it's been. Narratively fantastic, delicious gameplay, and even when it comes to the aspects of an open world that have been done to death, Ghost of Tushima manages to give them stylistic touches that freshes them up, and also makes them fun to interact with. It's a really well-crafted experience worthy of praise. So, now that we've discussed the base game at length, let's move on to the Iki Island DLC. The Iki Island DLC is... I'll be straightforward about it, it's not my favorite. I would classify it as the type of DLC that is just more of the same with the benefit of having a strong narrative. You see, this DLC focuses on the death of Jin's father, which is something that we've seen in the base game but otherwise was left unexplored. Iki Island is where he died, while attempting to bring the island under his rule. This sets up a very compelling story. Whereas we previously had a clash between the concept of samurai and ghost, we now have a clash between past and present. The people of Iki Island dislike the Sakai clan because of what they did in the past, leading Jin to not only have to conceal his identity, but also confront the idea that his father may not be that honorable figure he remembers. As a way to wrap up Jin's story, this is fantastic. We get to delve into his childhood and re-experience it through flashbacks, understand why he dislikes war, why he was distant to his father, and it culminates with Jin forgiving himself for not saving his father all those years ago, reaching a new understanding of what he felt and how it keeps shaping him as a ghost. This is most certainly the aspect in which this DLC shines. So why did I say that I did not really like it? The thing about Ghost of Tsushima, conceptually, is that it's deeply rooted in a realism of sorts. Sure, you have some gamified aspects, like yourself and allies being insanely durable to things that are deadly to any NPC, a move that is cool but otherwise has no place in a realistic setting, and even the wind itself serving as an indicator to you doesn't really make realistic sense. That's true. But when you look at the wider gameplay and the narrative, it's centered to a very large extent in reality. There's no superpowers or supernatural or paranormal happenings or point-blank things that cannot be explained in a realistic setting. This is where the Iki Island DLC fails to maintain that consistency. A large part of the narrative is driven by fever dreams caused by the poison given to Jin by the main villain, Miss Eagle here. And what this poison can do is quite incredible. As in, it's not believable at all. Now look, I'm not saying that poison can't cause hysteria or fever dreams, but to go as far as creating elaborate visions implying the villain can read Jin's mind, or even changing their perspective to such an extreme extent that they see a specific person who's not there, that's not just completely wild, it's the typical Ubisoft drug dream, except that it's this entire DLC story. It's how the Eagle learns Jin's plans, what facilitates their confrontation, and how Jin is able to face his father one more time. Make no mistake, I still think the writing is very strong. It's just a shame that the resulting narrative is so fundamentally reliant on this absolutely unbelievable crutch. Even in terms of side activities, you have things that just don't fit, like making Jin into a Disney princess or shrines with riddles that work in unreal ways. Ultimately, what made Ghost of Tsushima such a strong experience is the strong blend of gameplay and narrative that is bound by realism, and this inconsistency is what made the Iki Island DLC feel not quite right to me, despite being in large part more of the same. Finally, we have the Legends mode. This is the game's multiplayer component, and I'll say it's really good. It's a PvE mode with 4 classes, each featuring a different identity in combat via their abilities. The Samurai is strong in combat, the Hunter excels in ranged attacks, the Ronin is a support unit, that sort of stuff. They all have their own abilities, you can choose how to build them, and also choose different pieces of equipment with different stats and sometimes gameplay changing abilities. Now, just because you play a certain class, it doesn't mean you're locked out of certain combat aspects. You can still assassinate even if you're not an assassin, you can use a bow even if you're not a hunter, you can engage in melee combat just as well as a samurai would. These class differences are purely about the additive abilities they have on top of the default system. Now, if we're being completely honest, I do wish that by default these classes would have certain passives that make them more proficient in the areas they're meant to excel. For example, as an assassin, your critical strikes could be made to be as fast as quick assassinations, to really heighten how the class excels in stealth. Or as a hunter, you could have ranged buffs and arrow making as a passive built into the base kit. It would make it much easier to remain purely as a ranged unit, considering that arrows are not actually that plentiful. You see what I mean? Just a little more fleshing out and making these classes proficient in their roles beyond just special abilities. Now, the setting for this Legends mode is based a lot more on folklore and fantasy. It's about a priestess who was wronged in the past and returns with a vengeance, and an army of demons. This time around, I found myself far more permissive of these eccentricities. It's clear these are tales of legends which tend to be mystified by storytellers as they eventually become myths. With this specific premise, and frankly the premise being separate enough from the main story, I found myself being able to enjoy and even get immersed in these tales. For example, one of the modes you can engage with is a story mode of sorts, where you travel through Tsushima to thwart Yo's efforts of strengthening her demons. You have tales of twins having their hearts stolen to create pairs of demons that can revive one another from death, demons infused with stolen powers from gods, even phantoms being controlled to fight in the realm of the living. There is a strong mythological flair to all of this, presented beautifully with visually stunning environments, and it's all done to make you feel like you're stepping into a different world of legends yourself, which I most certainly did. Each tale adds something new, a new mechanic, a new layer of complexity, and they also have some replayability to them. Different difficulties can change things up, bringing mechanics from one tale to another and combining them to keep the challenge fresh. Apart from that, we have Rivals, a PvPvE-ish mode where you and another player have to compete against another duo in killing enemies swiftly, gathering currency, and buying roadblocks to stop the other team's progress. It's a lot more fun than I expected it to be, and the variety of maps that it has can make matches feel rather fresh. There's different layouts, and sometimes different mechanics accompanying them. We also have Survival, basically defending 3 areas from waves of enemies. Featuring boss waves with different modifiers and bonus challenges, this mode is great for leveling up your classes and farming equipment, or even purifying cursed items or doing challenges to increase item power for higher level content. Lastly, there is also an endgame, present both as a nightmare difficulty and the Tale of Io, basically a high difficulty continuation of the story as the ghosts take down Io and work through challenging puzzles that require both cooperation and communication. It's that standard sort of raid-esque high-level content, but it manages to be both difficult and engaging, and surprisingly long too, which I mean positively, just so that we're clear. The puzzles have some nice variety to them and require cooperating in engaging ways, except for the attunement-related floating platforms. Those ones can go get fucked. And it's all wrapped around in an engaging narrative and really high production quality. The effort they put into this is genuinely palpable and frankly impressive. Overall, it's quite well done. And what gets me about this mode is that it's completely free. I mean, sure, you have to own the game or have grabbed the standalone expansion for free when it was given away for that 1 month on PSN, but what I mean to say is, other than that, it's completely free. There is no microtransactions, premium currencies, or whatever other bullshit have you. It's so great to see a multiplayer mode tacked onto a single-player experience in a way that manages to shine on its own. Do you all remember when single-player games started adding multiplayer modes that no one asked for, taking away from development time that could have went to make a game better? How they all became a slippery slope into microtransactions, as if it ever was acceptable to ask more money for some mode that is by itself mediocre and will eventually get its support shut down in 1 year or 2. Seriously, most of these are ghost towns now. Barely anyone plays them anymore. Legends, on the other hand, is still incredibly active for a mode that is, at this point, about 5 years of age and hasn't seen any new content for a while. And everything can be earned by just playing and completing challenges. Isn't that such a shocking thing to say? So many costumes, and really good looking ones too, with solid gameplay to boot. Absolutely fantastic. This should be the standard of every separate multiplayer mode going forward. Ghost of Tsushima has been an excellent gaming experience, one of the best games I've played in recent memory. I've already sung praises to its combat, writing, world, and pretty much everything in between, so to avoid the risk of sounding repetitive in an already long video, I'll stop here. Given how strong Ghost of Tsushima has been overall, I am deeply interested and to a very large extent convinced in the real possibility that Ghost of Yotei will be a highlight in the AAA space this year, and frankly even beyond. I mean, pretty much every big budget game gets DLC, that's just one thing you can trust will stay consistent in this industry, and there's always a possibility it may even get a Legend-style multiplayer component, to which I will be absolutely giddy to get into when it releases. And that's all I have to say for this absolutely fantastic game. Thanks for watching, make sure you like and subscribe if you want to help me grow this channel. The next video will be on Ghost of Yotei, and as I'm writing this, I can't wait to get into it and get its platinum trophy. So, thanks again for checking this video out, and have a good one.